And we are back on the 0 hour. You know, a lot of people, of course, are talking about the issue of college affordability. There is now a growing movement to provide free public higher education. But in the meantime, it's no exaggeration to say, as we've been saying on this show, that we're facing a student debt crisis. But that raises the question, what exactly is the cause of rising tuition, particularly at public institutions of higher learning? And our next guest has done a terrific job of analyzing that very question. He is Robert Hiltonsmith. He is a senior policy analyst with the think tank Demos, and he joins us now. Robert, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Richard, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Listen, you did a great piece here. You did a great brief on pulling up the higher education ladder, myth and reality, and the crisis of college affordability. Rather than me paraphrase it, why don't you tell us just briefly what you found?
Sure. To give a little background, we looked into this because even though a lot of folks have been arguing that cuts to state support for higher education were the major drivers of tuition increases, we kept seeing in the media and in discussions elsewhere all of these other theories get a lot of airplay, right? So theories about, it's administrative bloat that's causing tuition increases, or it's excessive building on campuses and such. So we really wanted to do our part to see if we could put the question to rest as much as we could. And so we delved deep into the data and looked at all of the expenditures and revenues of all public universities in the country, and found in the end that state cuts to state support were actually responsible for 80% of all tuition increases across public four-year universities. Administrative bloat, or at least increases in administrative expenses, we should say, only accounted for about 5% of those, and those could easily be explained by increases in healthcare costs for universities, or increased spending on IT, any of these other things. And we think that this, hopefully at least gives an idea of what's really driving tuition increases at public schools.
Well, this is such an important issue, and that's why I'm glad, number one, that you addressed it. Number two, I learned a lot from this because it strikes me, you mentioned that I think it was originally Reagan's education secretary, William Bennett, who argued that perhaps college has become much more expensive because of the availability of student loans. And this struck me as kind of analogous to the conservative argument that there was a housing bubble because of affordable federally backed loans and housing, which is, by others also been disproven. But I guess my point here is that as we have this conversation about this, and you do, by the way, it was very timely because there was a piece I'm sure you saw in the New York Times arguing that seven-figure administrative college president costs and so on were a driver here. You've basically found that these are not significant costs, and it really has to do with cutbacks at the state level in tuition funding. And doesn't that argue, I mean, I realize this is an analysis and not an piece of advocacy work directly on your part, but doesn't this kind of suggest that what we really need to do to make college affordable is get that state funding back up to where it used to be?
Most certainly. I think that's the very clear and obvious, next step and conclusion from this. I mean, if that's precisely what's driving tuition prices through the roof, right? That, the converse, restoring state funding, along with, maybe some kind of agreement to get tuition costs under control at the same time, right, would precisely do that, right? And I'm glad you brought up the Bennett hypothesis as well, because we did address that in the paper and really found absolutely no support for that. And I thought your analogy is perfect. Again, it's the argument that the right often makes, basically saying that, in essence, government subsidies, government support is what's screwing up and causing problems. To be very broad, that's the argument that's often made, and we just don't find any support for it, particularly here, and elsewhere as well. And I think that you're right. We do need to hone in on this problem of state funding. I mean, the cuts have been huge, right?
Absolutely, and I wanted to highlight. We're talking with Robert Hiltonsmith of Demos. I wanted to highlight a statement you made in here, which I thought was striking and yet well documented. And you said, figure 5, I think it is, illustrates a disturbing fact. Public higher education in this country no longer exists because more than
Yeah.
half of core educational expenses at quote unquote public four-year universities, I'm quoting you now, your brief now, are now funded through tuition. I'll repeat that. More than half of core educational expenses at public universities are now funded through tuition, which is a private source of capital. They have effectively become subsidized private institutions. This is interesting because, as you know, public education has a long and distinguished history in this country. How did this counter revolution, if you will, happen, you think?
Well, I think there are a couple of factors at play here, right? And I think it's really, I'm glad you brought that quote up because it's something, we really want to hammer home. Of course, just passing that 50% threshold is just a matter of degree, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to recognize we've gotten past that point as a, means of starting this conversation. And I think what happened to some degree was that, as with a lot of other public investments in the country, we've seen deliberate attacks coupled with just lack of support for a lot of public structures in the country, right? We've seen attacks on almost every major, public source of investment or capital. And I think that, for either, we can debate about the cause of it or whatnot, but for whatever reason, that's been the effect, right? That, there's this idea that we should be privatizing a lot of things, that we should be putting the costs on the individual for almost everything across society.
Right.
And this is just the kind of latest example of this kind of ideology taking hold.
I think that's a great way to put it. And I absolutely agree that it's kind of part of a broader assault on the notion of shared responsibility for things like public goods like education and privatization frenzy or trend or whatever you want to call it. And to that point, Robert Hiltonsmith, I'd love to bring up another statement you made, another finding you had, which I found striking as well. And again, I'll quote you, but bear with me. You said spending at colleges on auxiliaries, including dormitories and dining services, has indeed increased significantly over the past decade, and you cite the figures. However, and this speaks to the privatization conversation, I think. However, revenue from these enterprises, which cover most of the costs associated with them, has risen even more rapidly. In 2011, revenue from auxiliary enterprises like cafeterias and so on actually exceeded spending by a significant margin. In other words, I take that to mean that while nobody was looking, these essential services, eating, sleeping, became profit centers for
Absolutely.
the American college system. Isn't that another kind of, I don't want to use loaded language, but it's what comes to mind. Isn't it a kind of a more revenue extraction from the individual rather than sharing this cost for the betterment of society?
Oh, absolutely. I think that a lot of times when we talk about college costs, the cost of the costs that aren't tuition costs get kind of pushed to the side, right? And it's good you brought this up because really tuition is only a part of the story, right? The costs for all of these things, which are necessary to any student, pursuing a degree. You got to eat, you got to sleep somewhere, right? Whether it's on campus or off campus, right? Schools have recognized that, I think that they have a captive audience to some degree and can kind of charge what they will to some degree for some of these services. And, this also goes to the privatization issue here because it's not with dorms, but with the cafeteria stuff, a lot of those are privatized, right? Those are often run by private corporations, right? It used to be Sodexo. I forget who runs a lot of them these days, but again, just another.
I think Aramark may be in there.
Aramark, yeah, that's exactly right. It's Aramark who runs a lot of them. That's right. So, it's just another way of putting offloading costs on individuals. And this is why, for example, I think I said tuitions increased by something like $3,000 over the past decade, right? An average of $3,000. But we've seen student debt, the average debt people graduate with, go up by something like $10,000, right? So that's some of the reason why student debt has increased so dramatically is because, of these other costs as well. They're not just borrowing to pay tuition, they're borrowing to pay for food and dining and books and all the additional fees and all these other things.
That is absolutely an excellent point. And I guess the last area I wanted to explore with you in your study of the cost drivers behind increasing college unaffordability, another statement I wanted to chat about, because I think this is important too. In the past, you wrote, state funding for education often rose and fell along with the economy, which makes sense, of course, as things get tight, they may cut back temporarily and so on. And as you say, since higher education funding is viewed as discretionary, it's often a target for cuts and so on. But however, and this is important, I think, in the past decade, state funding for higher education has diverged from that trend. 6 years after the Great Recession, of course, that's your study point. State higher education funding per student remains 27% below its pre-recession level, which again increases debt and so on. So I guess what strikes me in reading that finding is that it almost seems like the forces of privatization didn't let a good crisis go to waste. They cut spending in reaction to the crisis, and then as things began to strengthen a bit economically, they kept spending low anyway. Is that a fair conclusion?
Exactly, yeah. And I do think that, what you summarized there really represents this divergence. We did see spending used to go up and down with the recession, as you said, with recessions and business cycles. But in and of itself, we should note that that's a problem. Obviously, funding for schools should never have been subject to those kind of things, to those economic fluctuations. That was a problem for schools to begin with, having that fluctuating funding. But now, even worse, as you said, we've really diverged in that path. It hasn't, funding hasn't recovered, and I think that's indeed the story. And we're seeing this. And, not only has it not recovered, but now we're seeing a bunch of governors actively trying to further cut spending, right? Scott Walker is trying to cut $300 million from the University of Wisconsin system. It's about 20% of its budget, right? Bobby Jindal is trying to make about 20% cuts to the Louisiana public schools. And there's several others out there who are really actively targeting this. This is... not only is it not getting better, but it's getting worse.
And there are only two ways that can play out, as I can see it, when you make these drastic cuts to education budgets. One is that it hammers the middle class even more, trying to come up with this money, drives people deeper into debt. That's one. Or number two is more and more people are shut out of the opportunity for advancement, which is supposed to be fundamental to the American dream.
Absolutely. That's the purpose these public institutions were founded on. It's part of what made them unique, and that is absolutely what's going to happen. Both of those will happen, and with all the concomitant issues that happen with student debt, as we've been seeing with its effects on all the financial parts of people's lives who have debt, right? This really, it's so fundamentally short-sighted. Is this kind of general defunding of public structures, but especially with higher ed, because the benefits, Scott Walker in particular, his kind of justification was, well, higher ed's basically job training, so since the benefits go to the individual should pay the cost, and this is just wrong. This is completely wrong, right? The benefits absolutely are not just private. They accrue to the entire society. We see all of these social and non-monetary effects from higher education that that is why it should be a public good, right?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. There are non-monetary values which have been documented by thinkers like John Dewey and Horace Mann and everyone else. It makes people better citizens, better participants in our society. So the economy benefits as a whole, and by the way, even on the monetary level, corporations benefit. So why not raise their taxes and support public education? I guess unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there. But Robert Hiltonsmith of Demos, you've written a terrific report. I'm going to try to promote it every way I can because it's a great addition to the public conversation. Thanks for writing it, and thanks for coming on the program.
Wonderful. Appreciate it so much, and thanks for giving me the chance to talk.
You bet. And we will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero